All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the fourth Real Lecture of 2020. We hope you're ready for another thought-provoking lecture. Firstly, we'd like to acknowledge the Wathaurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Tonight's guest is Kim Irons from Irons McDuff Architects. Kim Irons founded Irons McDuff Architecture in 2006. And with over 25 years of experience, Kim has worked both locally and internationally, including time at the OVGA, and is a member of the Victorian Chapter Council and various design review panels. The work at Irons McDuff is primarily residential, ranging from small alterations to new builds, as well as commercial community projects. Kim will be taking us through a lecture entitled People, Place and Pennies as part of this trimester's overarching theme of sustainability, discussing past and current projects in reference to the underlying question, how can architecture support a more connected society and better outcomes for the public realm? Before we get started, as this is possibly the first lecture for many of our visitors tonight, I'll explain who we are and why we initiate these lectures. The Real Lectures are a series of student-organised industry lectures featuring practicing architects and industry professionals. The Real Lectures have been running at Deakin University for over 10 years and were established to pursue engaging, topical and thought-provoking architectural discourse between those in the field and those studying. As architecture students, or those simply interested in architecture, we are aware of the surface level discussion in a lot of architectural media and in the general public. The curation of the Real Lecture series is to explore beyond that surface level discussion and instead to investigate the why, delving into a deeper conversation about the built environment. You can stay up to date with us on Facebook and Instagram, and also on our blog. And if you'd like to see more of the Real Lectures, you can also see previously recorded lectures on our Facebook page and blog. All right, now I'll hand over to Kim.
Thanks, Robbie. Now, am I sharing my screen or not? Does somebody want to tell me if I'm managing?
Not just yet.
Not sharing my screen just yet. Sorry, there are lots of buttons here. And then I need to open the PowerPoint. And we've got to start all this again. There we go. So is everybody right to see that screen?
Yep, good to go.
Places, People and Pennies. Okay, great. Thanks, Robbie, Katie, and the rest of the team at Real. Look, today, based on the guiding theme established by Real Lectures this year, sustainability, our environmental, cultural and social obligations, we thought we would offer an insight into our practice, both in the work and all the projects, but mainly in how we work. So it's not so much a show and tell, but the story behind. So Robbie's covered a lot of the background about me, but just to expand a little, previously I worked in Melbourne Design Studios, mainly on residential, community and education projects. In the mid-2000s, I relocated overseas to work in Ireland on multi-residential neighbourhood centres, occasionally the individual house, and predominantly hotels, which was a very big part of tax incentives across Ireland at the time. On leaving Ireland, and this is a kind of funny anecdotal story, it was suggested by my boss at the time that I should start my own practice. So I naively did so, returning to Australia with a few projects that were already committed before I arrived, and the practice commenced in a converted garage on the property in Barwon Heads. In the midst of this, as Robbie mentioned, I also had the opportunity to work part-time in the Office of Victorian Government Architect, advising government agencies on good design and specifically associated with transport projects. And from that, developing my own urban design experience at a broader level. And I mention that because it's important to us within our practice to discuss what is good design and to recognise the benefits of good design. So it has us questioning how we can add community and public value to projects that are predominantly private residential. So for the most part, this is the region in which we work, which is the Bellarine Peninsula at the southwest corner of Port Phillip Bay. And our studio is located in Point Lonsdale at the very head of the bay. It's quite a luxurious sort of location. We have a shopfront in the main street. This is our window, which is working very hard for us at present while we're not in there. So there are some images of some of the projects that we'll be talking about today, and models of models, which is also what we like to do in terms of exploring design form and explaining to the client. As we work through the images today, you'll see that we use a variety of tools. You probably won't see a lot of 3D renders, etc. We do use that as a tool, but there's a lot of models and sketches that we use, and we value this as part of the head to heart to hand process in design thinking. So this is our team: Brett, Finley, George, Josh, me, Nick and Beck. In particular, I'll point out Brett, who joined us in 2016 after moving down to the coast, and he is now an equal partner in Irons McDuff Architecture, which is in its transitions into another name. We're a deliberately small team on the basis that both directors are significantly involved in the work, and it allows us to spend more time directly on projects rather than managing a larger practice. Having benefited from a past where experienced practice was essential to moving into what we would now call the Masters of Architecture, we also have a policy of employing students to help develop the future of our profession. What's been a great outcome out of this is that most of our students have continued with us as graduates and sometimes as registered architects. So we feel like we're a very close-knit team. Several years ago, I had the privilege of interviewing Neil Everest. He was the founding partner of McGlashan Everest, and it was for an article in Great Ocean Quarterly in which we discussed what I thought to be the hidden treasures of their work in the Bellarine and the southwest coast, essentially Wadawurrung country. It was an exploration into the unsung humble dwellings that are mostly holiday houses, but some are more permanent, their modernist qualities and their sensitive responses to site. During the interview, Neil observed that houses we explored at the time with him were about people and place. And then at the last minute, he added, and pennies. While obvious all of these inform architectural briefs, it had a particular resonance with me as we work regionally, often in a particular place with which we have great familiarity or some other regions. And our budgets are more in the $3,000 to $4,000 a square metre, somewhat restricted compared with many of our city colleagues and award-winning dwellings at $5,000 a square metre and upward. However, one could also take the term pennies, and perhaps today we could reframe that as resources. Now, I should say that lower budgets don't necessarily mean lower design quality. This is something we would often argue in the OVGA. And I'll say that that's the Office of Victorian Government Architect abbreviation, or in design review panels, that good design doesn't necessarily cost, and that in fact good design can save money in the long term and when given time to analyse, propose, test and reanalyse. And good design is not just how something looks, but how it works, what more it contributes to the community or public realm, and how people feel and behave. And in government, we often refer to sustainability measures in the terms of environmental, social and economic. So the idea that they're measured equally. So today I'm suggesting if we take the term people, places and pennies, it could also be considered as key measures of sustainability in terms of environmental, social and economic. Therefore, among other aspects in our design approach, we are interested in what lies in creating or problem solving the preparation of places for people within limited pennies or resources. So rather than take you through each project, I thought I would present an approach through the lens of each of these three elements. While divided into these three categories, it's important to recognise that, like anything associated with design, they all intertwine to respond to the brief, the client and the site. So it's not necessarily prioritised in the order in which I'll speak about them. So first of all, place. So if we start with place or country, it's really what is the story of this place, Indigenous or white settlement or since white settlement. While we do not profess to know the Indigenous story of a place, we believe it is an important step in our process to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we will be working. But also in identifying country, it can enable a better understanding of place in terms of the ground, the soil, the topography, the vegetation and fauna, water flows and the climate. So the role of site analysis for us is very important to then draw those aspects of place, not just solar orientation, but other aspects, and they all become very important. So, for example, working in southwestern Victoria, we're very aware of encountering southwesterly winds as a predominant aspect of our area. So moving straight to one of the projects in this area is Deans Marsh, which is located in the back hinterlands of the Otways there, and you can see quite clearly the rural land to the rear and the Otway Mountains themselves. And this site is quite remote, off a side road with other residential properties, but quite a large site with a very steep slope site and incredible views southward towards the back of the Otways and what would be the distant Southern Ocean. So even in the way of hand-formed drawings, we undertake site analysis to get to know the place better. So in this case, identifying winter shade, where the views are, views specifically to dams, cold winds, cooler summer breezes, the sun, etc. And also importantly on this site, issues to do with fire track access for the Country Fire Authority vehicles, because this is in a bushfire area, and also an effluent field to deal with sewage waste. The other thing that was particularly unique to this site was that the slope is around 22 degrees, which is incredibly steep. So one of the things we did quite early was obtain a geotech soil test, which immediately informed the architecture because the site was prone to slippage. And so we needed to actually approach the building in a very different, in a very sort of light way. And we also explored the context and especially the utilitarian shed, which the client was very drawn to. But as you can see from this too, that idea of light structures on the landscape that are elevated above the ground plane, and in this case to also deal with flood levels. So the proposition was a very long building that takes in all of the views across the site, and almost like a form of shearer's quarters in a sort of long extended row, but then cranked slightly to follow the contours of the site. So walking through, there's the main entry which enters at ground level, and then into a sort of discrete hallway until you go past these windows that expose the views. Off to the left here, which is towards the west, is the dining and kitchen area, and then the main bedroom suite, ensuite, etc. And then to the right-hand side of the page is really the guest quarters. So 2 bedrooms with a bathroom and a small bunk space area. And the proposition becomes something that you enter at the ground level to the roadside, but is well elevated on the southern side. There's approximately a 4 metre drop from one side of the building to the other, and it's only 5 metres wide. The structure at ground is restricted to a series of columns into foundations that actually bind the ground in and to reduce the slippage component of the whole property. And then we also explored through this the idea of the collection of sheds as additions, which we often see in the local vernacular, into the principal form, and particularly where the lower pods are to the front, are specifically lower so that there can be high-level windows above them. And in another bushland setting at Airies Inlet, we explored similar principles, but in this case there were adjacent dwellings on the slope site, either side and across the road. So we investigated how we could flow the house down the site and create a compact footprint while retaining a sense of bush escape for city visitors. So the principal form really wraps itself like an arm, sheltering the northern garden area from the southwesterlies and focusing on the bushland space within. Working through diagrams used to explain the approach, we also filtered the sort of integration of aspects down to associated elements, including sun, ventilation, and views. And then using a model to explore the form, you can see how that form starts as a highly elevated sort of building, particularly allowing for a car to park underneath. And then it flows down to the site with the falls of the site, with one of the roofs actually oriented to allow solar orientation for solar panels. the floor plan can be a little bit complex to understand. So the left-hand side shows what we call the entry area. So a ramp that leads up into the principal sleeping zone with 3 bedrooms that are also split on 2 levels. And then down a flight of stairs to the right there, which then lead down into the broader kitchen living space. A north-facing deck, and which also becomes the second entry into the house with car spaces adjacent. And here in this section, the idea of the sort of split levels that actually fall down with the contour of the site across the property. And here you start to see the form of where cars park underneath, next to those trusses. And there's bedrooms elevated, and then to the left there is a bit of a deck space. But when we also go analysing sites, there are others, such for instance at Port Arlington, which is a new subdivided site in a more suburban setting with north-facing front garden and distant views to the bays. It's a very slightly sloped context, which includes a Victorian heritage dwelling to the west and a 60s gable to the east. So the site analysis here becomes something a bit more layered. It includes diagrams associated with climate, wind, sun, etc., and views, but it also picks up issues to do with privacy and overlooking potential overshadowing from neighbouring properties. And there's a red element there in the centre that you can see that's also the views being somewhat marred by a massive electricity pole. And so it's important to us that we always set up a context of elevations so that we understand, we can see this in a 3D form as well, and not just as a plan. So here you can see that the Victorian cottage is quite elevated, even though it's only single storey on the right-hand side to the west. We have an electricity pole in the middle of the site, more or less, and then a low 60s dwelling on the left-hand side. So our response was to bring in a 2-storey element towards the Victorian side that starts to become of a similar scale of that building, given that it's a more elevated platform, and then uses a sort of long lean-to 60s, 70s form leading down to that 60s house on the low side. Not that that 60s house will always be there, but that was our response also to the overall site and the program. And again, we use diagrams as a sort of reductive explanation of the concepts and the response to the principal ideas of circulation, climate response, massing and zoning. Hopefully they're straightforward. So here you start to see how we've taken those diagrams, and I'll flick back. So diagrams associated with zoning, circulation, etc. And we start to allow them to start to inform the architecture. So here we have organisation with an entirely open living, dining, kitchen area to the eastern wing as a singular space, and then bedroom or main bedroom with ensuite, which is a shared bathroom and laundry to the lower level, and the garage. And then at the upper level, we have the zoning for the younger adults, where they have an upper living zone and then 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, but still with a visual connection to the lower level through the living room wall to the east there. We'll also look at context in terms of not just plan, but form, as we said. And sometimes that form is how can we proportion. So we were dealing with a heritage dwelling to the right-hand side, and we started to explore the idea of proportions, not just the gable forms, but just equally the proportions and how that form might be respectful to the adjacent heritage property. And so again, looking at the plan, so the heritage property here is shown to the top of the page, so on the northern side. So our building seeks to step the wing closest to that further back, so that it's being respectful to the heritage dwelling, while the other wing steps forward. And then all the kitchen, living, dining zone is oriented to the north, bedrooms and amenities, etc., oriented to the south. But then, of course, in the case of alterations and addition, the context is layered with an existing built form. And so often we're finding ourselves analysing the core elements, the critical spaces to match the program, or the most sound and robust elements of the existing structure. And within a city context, we're also looking at other impacts, not just adjoining properties, but particularly in this case, the proximity of to freeway noise. So again, our response explores through sections how we might maximise our response to climate. And particularly in this case where you'll see in the next diagram, we had an existing building with a north-facing wall that was completely solid because it was on the boundary. So here we use the existing footprint and then start to explore what are the key elements that are required to meet the program, but also in this case was particularly around connecting the property back to the garden. And you can see on the left-hand side there some sort of arbitrary utilitarian spaces that that block the views from the dining space into the garden area. So this is a two-storey building. So the decision was to pare back the building right back to kitchen, dining, living with the main stair, and remove all of that utilitarian area as an enclosed space and create a new outdoor deck area with a cute little outdoor bathroom and shower. So sort of recreating the backyard toilet, or the backyard dunny as we used to call it with the client. And then upstairs we've retained the idea of 3 bedrooms, but reconfigured bedrooms noted there as 10 and 10 to maximise the space available. Obviously, in residential projects, clients are the principal people in our work. They inform the program, but how many, for instance, how many people, how many guests, how would they like to live? However, we do believe we have an obligation to the community or the public realm. So this might be through a respectful approach that does not dominate or overshadow, but there are also other aspects we're interested in pursuing. So there are small gestures we like to integrate to encourage a stronger, more connected community and hopefully a better social outcome. And I think at this present time, with us living in isolation under COVID, this seems an even more relevant approach in how we might value small moves. There's a lot of evidence associated with the importance of visual connection to community and mental health, but also there's a lot of evidence in crime where properties with high fences are more likely to be subject to theft or home invasion than those with low fence or none at all. So we're drawn to street frontages as shown in these two images with recessed gates, verandas and bench seats, which provide passive surveillance and community connection and almost a sense of invitation to come in, as opposed to the lower image where higher fences create a sense of disconnect of the occupants from the public realm. So how do we then marry that in some of our projects that are obviously private? So in the case of Deans Marsh and Aries, both are predominantly used by couples, but with a need to accommodate guests. Significantly, the clients have a strong desire to have a sense of escape to the bush and to maximise their private views. But the challenge with these visual connections is to the public realm, and how do we provide passive surveillance to minor roads? So in the case of Deans Marsh, what we've done is snuck in a study window, or in the dining room, we've snuck in smaller windows that not only capture the northern sun to that orientation, but also provide views to the street. At Aries Inlet, we've used screened balconies that provide privacy while also allowing enough transparency to provide observation over the local street. In this case too, in the addition of the privacy, these screens operate to filter the westerly sun from the internal spaces. And in Port Arlington, the northern orientation gave us the opportunity to place living spaces to the north or to the front of the property, so that the family of 4 starts to become more connected to their community from both this living space and the living space at the upper level. I have to apologise for these photos. We haven't had this one photographed yet. COVID prevented that to a degree. And on this property too in Port Arlington, the idea of a fence that secures the family and pets but is low and transparent and enough to maintain street connection when one is in the garden. And at Point Lonsdale again, there's no fence, but the use of a smaller window enabling some privacy in the dwelling, but a connection to local street activity is glimpsed while working in the kitchen. So you can see on the left-hand side the external image. This landscape is far more established now. There's a bedroom to the left, but the long, narrow slot window is a kitchen window. And the image on the right-hand side shows that view as you're standing in the kitchen, looking out to the tea tree on the street and people passing by. The house also pursues aspects of ageing in place for an older couple. Again, this is one of our social responsibilities. While it's slightly elevated above the ground at points due to the natural topography, entries have been configured with a ramp to natural ground to the rear and large platform steps to the front that enable the use of walking frames to enter the house. So instead of being a 300 mil step, it's something like 700 or 800 mil, so you can get a decent walking frame on and take the next step. The house is then arranged on a single level with no steps internally, large doorways to enable universal access, and configurations to bathrooms that enable grab rail installation in the future, as well as some of them being incorporated today as towel rails. Other elements within this are really about the people, and they accommodate integrated storage to display the collections of art, books and ceramics gathered over a lifetime and shared with guests upon the entry. So on the left, a hallway with lots of bookshelves and cabinets displaying the ceramics. On the right-hand side, timbered walls with artwork, and further to the right is a whole wall surrounding the window to include all of their books and artefacts. In Parkville, it was more cultural aspects of retaining the history of a place, even though it wasn't a heritage dwelling, but a part of history during a time of austerity in the 1940s, which in this case the family was keen to encourage. Moves such as living spaces to the street were already given, but existing visual connections from the kitchen to the street were also maintained, so which is difficult to read, but that corner window on the left-hand side is the kitchen window. And we opened up the house as an environment focused on the kitchen as the social hub of the house. So a wall was removed completely between the formal dining space and the kitchen. So now the kitchen is reoriented with workbenches to three sides and a new island bench as the country table to the centre for shared activities around cooking. And then celebrating and encouraging sibling bonding and breaking down the status quo of separate bedrooms for each individual, we explored the idea of a space-saving device, which was a bunk bed that formed the wall between two bedrooms, but also had sliding panels to encourage the girls to have connection and dialogue with each other. Of course, they both have opportunities to shut the panels when it doesn't suit, and perhaps as they get older, that might be the case. But we're also interested in larger scale sustainable social structures and have been privileged to be collaborating with the Geelong Sustainability Group in conjunction with F2 Design on what's termed a microvillage. As most of you know, the affordable housing rate is rising quickly, and in particular, it seems to be that the fastest rising demographic is homeless women over 50. So we've been working with Microvillage to design, develop and pilot, the vision, sorry, I should tell you, is to design, develop and pilot a new community-led affordable cluster housing model in Geelong that supports a socially, environmentally and financially sustainable community. The important thing about affordability is that we tend to talk about affordable housing, but I think it's really important to understand affordable living. So the idea of creating sustainable communities is a really important one, because you can buy a house affordably, but you may be in a location that requires the family to have 2 cars, you're always using public transport, there's no amenities around you. So it's important that we focus on the idea of affordable living, but in this case, it's something that allows private ownership within communal living. So we see it as a variation on apartment development such as Nightingale, but we're pursuing a model of lower scale, more readily affordable option in regional areas. So the project goal is to develop, pilot and evaluate an affordable housing model in Geelong that caters for people with limited financial means and or people with a genuine desire to live with a small carbon footprint. It's the idea to increase diversity of housing types available, and to successfully advocate for changes to the current residential planning regulations that impede affordable cluster housing developments, and to demonstrate that a live small, live eco cluster housing model can be financially viable and socially successful. So within our own office, we investigated precedents, especially those of the 70s and 80s of cluster housings, such as that in Vermont, where titles were formed around the immediate house footprint, including a bit of a veranda space. And the grounds were all common property shared across the entire site, set in a specific landscape. Or Yellowstone, where the title boundaries are maintained but without fences. So there's blurred common areas between, even though there's there's title ownership of each piece of land. So we've been developing models of 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and 3 bedroom units, typically focused around a patio or terrace space that provides open space within a rectilinear lot, but also can in turn become a blurred private space that visually connects to the collective community. And we've started to explore sites, options on sites, learning from the cluster housing and Nightingale models. So the principles of connected, sustainable community with shared amenities, such as larger communal kitchen and dining spaces, so that you can have guests over, or a common laundry, or common garden and workshop areas, so that each property can be a little bit smaller because there is a common amenity elsewhere. Particularly, one of the things we're looking at is that we are trying to reduce the number of car spaces we need and have car spaces co-located in one location rather than dispersed across the site, which is what we see typically in these sort of single-storey residential developments where the planning scheme requires that the car is directly next to the unit. And then we've also tried to what we'll be trying to explore is the idea of specific groups within the group. So you can start to see we have almost little squares in between in the whole site plan that start to become smaller groups within the larger community. So now we're down to pennies, which is essentially resources. So I'd suggest this element is about resources, materials and energy. These are aspects we bring up within the briefing process with our clients. And it's part of the document we issue asking questions about their ambitions for the projects. So while there are many regulations associated with energy performance generally, how far we extend this tends to come down to the client's own ambitions and commitments. And I think this has been discussed in a couple of these real lectures before. As energy prices rise and alternative energy resources and equipment become more competitively priced, people are becoming more astute to improving the overall performance of their dwellings. So that's a plus. But the client does ultimately decide, and cost can be a factor. But again, there are some aspects that we endeavour to pursue, particularly those that are not necessarily associated with additional costs. So we consider them as first principles. Things like smaller footprint, orientation, as we've already discussed, and zoning. So smaller footprint allows lesser materials and less resource. Zoning and smaller footprint can allow less operational cost to heat, cool and light a dwelling. So again, in Deans Marsh, which is not a small house in the scheme of the projects we work on, this is used by a couple for the most part. So we deliberately, as we pointed out before, created a clear zone between where they might occupy, where there's the living, dining, kitchen and their bedroom and ensuite and study, etc., and the guest wing to the right-hand side of the page. So day to day, when there's no guest staying, that whole zone on the right-hand side is shut off. Now, this house has to perform entirely on electricity, so there's no unnecessary heating or cooling going on in that space, in those spaces when there's no one there. And it means that they're only heating and cooling one half of the house. The other thing that we haven't necessarily included in all of these images is that this house also has solar power and is offsetting pretty much most of the power that they use day to day. We also, and I should go back to that plan, item number 13 there, because I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. Yes. Oh, so this little space here, thank you. So at one point we did actually discuss having a third bedroom, but in an effort to reduce the footprint, we proposed this little space here as a sort of railway carriage space where one could put a bunk bed. So a pod externally with two little windows at exactly the right height for a bunk bed becomes the space internally for bunk beds for grandchildren and nieces and nephews to stay in. So again, a small footprint that's used temporarily to save resources, materials and energy. And at Airies Inlet, it was a series of small bedrooms for guests, but also a stacking of areas to allow additional sleeping space hidden beneath the floor of another bedroom, and steps used as storage. So the left-hand side I just thought I'd feature because that was the only part of the brief that he talked about, was that he needed to be able to display his absinthe dispenser. But we also created steps with little storage nooks, so all those little panels slide away. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the drawer unit, which is part of the daybed. And then behind that is another series of sliding panels. So if you draw those panels back, you can actually have 4 people lying down in that space with their heads out on the top of the daybed. The other aspect we, of course, explore is the issue of materials. So these are often subject to cost, and also they're subject to other circumstances such as fire resistance. But we do have a strong preference for using recycled or salvaged materials, compressed vapour products, etc. So while we haven't measured to date, we are working towards measurable outcomes of carbon footprints of the products that we use. However, for the interim, we do endeavour to resource materials within local suppliers wherever possible in an effort to reduce our carbon miles. In particular, we look at timber resourcing, and this is a timber that we used at Airies Inlet and we've used on a few projects now on the west. That's sugar gum that has been traditionally something that's been milled by a co-op of farmers from a timber that is basically chopped at the base and then regenerates. So in the past, it was used for fence posts and firewood in farming properties, and now we can get it for cladding and decking. And it's a really strong, solid material, and it's incredibly fire resistant. So we've used that across Airies Inlet, and particularly that it was a celebration of timber the client was really keen on. Because we're on the west of the state, we've looked at using sugar gum, but if we were working on the east of the state, we may look at using radially sawn silver top ash. So there's some of the principles we try to engage in terms of material. And then in Parkville, there was a reduction here of the whole footprint. So its approach to resources was about reducing the floor area, maximising natural daylight in and ventilation by actually reducing the building footprint altogether. And as I explained before, the idea of taking off these old appendages on the back and creating what's more of an outdoor room that allows light and air to come into these internal kitchen and dining spaces. And retaining the original old swelligant, as we used to call them, features of the house, but removing some of the more internalised aspects to the space so that there was more connection to outside, and creating that outdoor room with the outdoor dunny. And even things like utilising the laundry space at an upper level as a second personal washing space by simple methods like adding a mirror and making the trough something out of ceramic rather than just a stainless steel basic trough. And of course, there are other detailed material choices that we make that are common to all projects. So sometimes it's Hebel blocks to create thermal mass in a reverse brick veneer construction. Sometimes it more than often, well, in fact, every time, we always use low VOC paints. We're using water-based products which are becoming more common and much less of a challenge to builders. We pretty much double glaze everything unless we're using particular locations for louvers that allow us to purge the house at night or once the cool breeze arrives. And I think our rule of thumb is insulate, insulate, insulate. it's an incredibly affordable aspect of building in the scheme of the overall costs of a build. We also look to optimise lighting without excess, including external lights that guide you into a space but don't necessarily glare. And we're really keen on sweep fans as much as possible rather than air conditioning. Victoria, for the most part, is a temperate climate. And fans can reduce the perceived heat in the order of 5 to 10 degrees in any one space. I can't, however, downplay enough the need for the client commitment to take the project as far as it can go when it comes to sustainable outcomes. Aries, for example, was an example of client commitment. Whenever an issue arose, even moments on site when the builder had missed items, the client desire to meet program or costs was always overridden by sustainable benefits. And they also had a very keen interest in recycled materials, use of timber, as I said, throughout the house. So the building was a very carefully crafted expression of different timber junctions. And then I'm well ahead of time. But I thought finally to come back full circle to Neil Everest was to bring you to a project that we've recently been privileged to work on, which is an extension to a McGlashan and Everest house in Highton. It's a typical McGlashan and Everest house with classic restrained details, a very ordered grid layout, which is all principled on the idea of particular glazing sizes being economic and resourceful. So we've retained the original house and added a new garage, bedroom and bathroom in a very tightly clad timber building that's restrained with a glass link in between. And converted the existing carport into a library/study with glazing to the southern courtyard and direct link to the existing house on the right-hand side. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kim. That was terrific. We've got a few questions from the audience. So as usual, I'll get Katie to help me read out some of them. And we'll just take it in turns firing questions at you, Kim. Katie, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kim. That was really great. I liked how you broke down a few examples of how the practices kind of made real commitments to all the things you're talking about. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to start with where you began in the lecture, in the converted garage in Barwon Heads. And I'm going to ask, how do you think that your philosophy and the philosophy of the whole practice has changed over that time? Or do you think that you've stuck to certain ideas and kind of followed them through?
I think from an environmentally environmentally sense of sustainability, we've pretty much stuck to that. It does wax and wane with clients. And I think we did have a stage there where it seemed like some of our clients were not particularly interested in those aspects. We're seeing a resurgence of that, and whether that's through contacts or a change, an awareness of climate change, I'm not 100% sure. When it comes to the social sustainability aspects, I think a lot of that was really, as I said, sort of lessons I started to learn working in the Office of the Victorian Government Architect and having those conversations about how we can contribute to the public realm. And certainly when I was working there, we talked about affordable living and affordable housing quite a lot. And I became more and more aware of those papers and articles that were out there and the bigger issues.
So how do you think, you touched on there and you spoke earlier about kind of client commitment to the idea of sustainability and their own education. What do you think is the role of the architect in persuading the client or educating the client in those areas? Do you think that the client needs to come to you with that proposition, or do you think that you play a role in sort of showing them things they could do?
No, I think we certainly play a role in showing them. I think we're certainly starting to initiate conversations with clients about, for instance, turning away from gas. We certainly encourage smaller footprints generally. And look, sometimes that's also a budget issue, but we do try to explain that. I think one of the faults that we have, and is something we're looking to explore in our office more as practice, is actually having the evidence or the backup and the evidence to say, what will be the dollars that these people will save.
And you think sorry, go on.
No, and I think it's a harsh thing to say, that one would hope that everybody is as idealistic as we are. But that again is a lesson I learned in government, that sometimes you have to have the conversation with people in a language that they understand. Certainly in government, if we talked about dollars and jobs, that would win them over. And, people need to understand that if they're spending $5,000 on a solar hot water unit or a heat exchanger, what does that mean? What's the payback?
Yeah, like a tangible description of what they're going to get out of it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got a question from Aramol here, Kim.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, Kim. Thank you for delivering your lecture. Regarding the micro village project in Geelong, I would like to know what you think about clustering small affordable homes, possibly becoming a future residential housing model in Australia.
Well, obviously we're pursuing it as we think it would be a really positive outcome. I think it's offering a different typology, and it's offering something new to the market. And I think it's interesting how we hear the market wants. And it always seems to me that the market is actually the real estate agents telling us what the market is, as opposed to what is the market survey. I would certainly like to see this as a model that is seen much more prolifically, particularly in regional areas. I think given the dramatic change in demographic and household numbers, the number of people in households, this provides an opportunity for independent and communal living, and a really good sustainable way of living with shared amenities and affordable living, obviously. So, I mean, obviously we're incredibly interested in it. I think also what some friends and I had discussed it just here in Barwon Heads as an idea about ageing in place. So it's almost like another retirement village sort of model, but for a much broader demographic. And I think there's great merit in it, and it will certainly help us reduce the urban sprawl. So I guess yes, but that's why we're pursuing it. So of course we're interested in it as a new typology.
How willing do you find the general population, and not those, so you touched on some examples of previous examples of similar styles of building where they have communal shared spaces, like you say, common property and blurred boundary lines. How receptive do you think that the general population, who might have kind of kind of ideas from their own experience about having really delineated borders and things, how receptive do you think, or have you found people to be to that idea?
Look, I think it's like many things. There's no one solution fits all. And I remember the Aboriginal housing policy gets thrown around like it's one solution for everyone, whereas there's got to be a solution. There's different solutions for different people. So I think some people won't be on board. In the same way that I talked about the low fence, I know some people are, no matter how much we talk about low fences with them and try and persuade them that way, they will dig their heels in. It's just something, they have a perception that a high fence will be safer for them. So there are people who will have a perception that living in a communal housing arrangement isn't for them, or is something that it's not. And they are things that, I must admit, when we were briefing, we've been briefing with a number of the potential clients, and there have been tensions. There are tensions around security, whether or not it should be a secure gated facility, which for the most part, people were saying no. But then we had a couple of people saying, no, it's really important it's secure. Now, my concern was that these could have been women who've come out of domestic violence, and that may be what was driving their sense of what is security. And that's the other, is what's a perceived sense of safety versus what's a real safety aspect. So I think it won't be for everyone. But I think the more we can build these models and demonstrate these models, probably the more people will come on board.
Yeah, I think that is like what you touched on earlier, the evidence. People want to see it in action, see it happening.
Yeah.
Okay, probably touching on that one slightly, Kim. Home ownership has long been a dream for many Australians, but many clients seem to be more focused on affordable housing rather than affordable living, as you...
Price rises quite dramatically. So I think for first home owners, it's the risk. It's also the risk. One of the things that we're trying to battle is how to bring the banks on board. So, and the banks are the things that will make it difficult for people to actually invest in these properties.
Great, thanks, Kim.
I was going to touch on just a question, especially with your experience in government, and just wondering about what role you think, personally, especially with your experience, that the government plays in this kind of sustainable mission. I know that you mentioned earlier, these are your personal values, and so you can embed them into your practice. So where do you think that the role of each individual kind of like putting those ideas into their design versus the government legislating or mandating particular things in terms of like sustainable specs and everything?
I suppose in my mind, architects have been creating sustainable design since, I don't know, the 60s or 70s or something, when we started to open up curtain walls to glazing, etc. Robin Boyd, Neil Clarahan, etc. I think what government does, albeit they are small moves, is they try to raise the lowest common denominator. And sometimes that's the best they can do. Look, I think they should be innovators. I think they should be leaders. But the political environment is fraught with immediate change. And this is a long conversation really about particularly how social media has changed politics, how we have daily polls now, factions within parties, etc., change things dramatically. So getting bipartisan agreement on a policy is incredibly challenging. So I think government does have a role to play, but I think it is challenged to do that. And it's really up to the private sector and private industry and individuals as much as possible to make that change. And there's small things, like we know, for instance, through Architects Declare, that, the idea that we've all, and I must admit our practice has been signed on for green energy since 2006 in the garage. But if we all sign on to green energy, if every individual signs on to green energy, then we're creating a demand that will force a supply. So I guess I'd like to see government change, and I think it depends on the politics at the time, but I do think that we have to lead it ourselves. And again, we often have to demonstrate, the private sector has to demonstrate to government why it's a value and how it can actually work. I think that's the general consensus when you talk to industry, generally, whether it's property investment, superannuation companies, all of these big corporates, I think they're all saying, we can't wait for government to change. We have to lead by example and lead it for ourselves. And they know the risks. They know the risks with climate change. We just don't know who's talking to the politicians and telling them otherwise.
Yeah.
So I've got another question here from Danica. Hi, Kim. how do you think we can change perceptions and educate the general public better on the inclusion of sustainable aspects so they have a better understanding before those initial meetings, and they're the ones coming to us more willing to consider or pay for double glazing, zoned areas, specific cladding, etc.?
I don't know. Again, I think it might be evidence, demonstrating, having people talk about it more. I think as architects, we probably do need to demonstrate and provide more evidence to people to bring them on board. Yeah, I'm not sure I can sort of respond in another way, really. We can certainly, but I think that said, you know, we can also educate clients as we go along. So a client might come to us who doesn't seek those ambitions at all, but it doesn't mean, like I said, you know, it doesn't mean we don't pursue them. It doesn't mean that we don't quietly, stealthily reduce their footprint. It doesn't mean that we haven't set up zoning or, you know, like I said, we, you know, for years now we've specified low VOC paints. Now, one of the first times I did it, the painter, the builder was, you know, oh, what's this crazy thing you're doing? And then a week later said, my God, it's amazing. You know, there's no smell in here. And I said, so imagine what it's like for the client. You know, I said, you know, good for you, good for the client. So there are things that you can do as, I think, as an architect that don't necessarily, that are good design outcomes. That I'm not saying that you're pulling the wool over the client's eyes, but that you're just doing them as a matter of course. And perhaps in months to come, once the client's in the house, then they'll understand those key moves you've made. You know, like putting a window in a position that means that you can sit in a comfortable chair or a day bed and absorb that winter sun, but in summer that day bed is shaded. You know, they're the things that you do that sometimes the client simply has to discover them once they've moved in. So
I might just add to that. Do you find more often that clients come to you, they're very enthusiastic in employing as many sustainable ideas as possible?
Look, like I said, it wax and wanes depending on the clients. I think what's interesting is the number of clients who come to us with what we would probably, or what I would refer to as the bells and whistles. So, we have to have solar panels, we want solar hot water service, you know, we want all of the add-ons. And we say that's absolutely fine. They are the add-on costs, which is the interesting thing. They do have savings, obviously, in the long term, but they're in the initial investment, they're extra costs. And so that's why we say we like to come back to first principles. So reduce the footprint overall, make the house as efficient as possible. And that can also be in volume. That's not just in floor plan, but that also can be in volume, you know, in terms of ceiling heights, so that they're spacious and air moves around readily. We can have ceiling fans that don't feel like they're going to chop off your head, etc. But equally, they're not so volumetric that they're using up a lot of heating. Zoning. So zoning of bedrooms, zoning of different wings, for instance, we're finding we're doing a lot more houses where we're suggesting zoning of houses to also allow for children to grow and potentially be adults living in the house. So we've just done one recently where we've set up a sort of second living rumpus multi-purpose guest room space. So it's doing many, many things, but it can also become an end of the house that should an adult child be there still in their 20s or 30s, they have a sense of somewhat independent living. So I think, yeah, I think there are people coming with those things, but we do still try and push to them the first principles that we will try and make the house initially as efficient as possible. So even if they do add all the solar panels, those solar panels will be paying them some money rather than just offsetting the power they're using.
Have you found in the industry, when you're working with builders, anyone, you know, other professionals that you're in touch with during the process, design process and construction, do you find they're receptive to all of the things that you mentioned, reducing footprints, if they need to use special paints like the paint art that you mentioned? Or do you find the whole industry is moving with you, or are you finding specific people that kind of embody what you want to achieve and just particularly work with them?
No, I don't think we particularly seek out people. We do often have to educate our builders with things, but I mean, builders are always behind us not in thinking, but that sounded terrible. But they're always a little bit behind on sort of advanced things that are going on. Not all of them. Some of them are very aware of things, and it comes down to personality too. Like some electricians are really interested in solar power, etc., and will pursue that and push that. We have a plumber, for instance, who is now pushing don't use gas. Now he's putting himself out of work, but he's on board with it and he gets it. So it does vary according to personalities. But like I said, it can be a little slow. So we did the low VOC paints, and it was a little bit of a dialogue, and now it's fine. That said, there are still painters out there who are very old school, who want to use enamel on certain things, and it's because it works this way and da 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 da. So I think it's changing. I think what's really interesting is watching the builders who are registering as passive house builders. So obviously, again, you can't say that one sort of industry is in one particular frame of mind, because there's obviously builders out there who are really interested in these sorts of principles, and passive house it's been interesting seeing builders actually sign on to passive house.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear. Obviously, as a student, we don't have as much, touch. We're not in touch with as many builders and things like you mentioned. So it's interesting to hear from your perspective how that kind of plays into it. I wanted to ask just something that you mentioned earlier on when you're talking about the Dean's Marsh building, and how you talked about it, a visual of it, and talked about it looking like the collection of sheds, and how they all kind of get stuck together in kind of rural landscapes. How do you find as an architect that kind of that playfulness plays into all of this? So after you've taken all your considerations in, do you make that a key element that you want to include, or do you think it comes along with as the design unfolds, it's going to be created, or is it important to you, or what do you think about that?
Sorry, is the playfulness or the form?
Yeah, well, I sort of thought that comment kind of leaned towards, like this idealistic or like a rose-tinted view of like the landscape. I thought it was a sweet little mention. So do you intentionally put those visuals or the aesthetic, or try and incorporate that kind of thing into your design, or you think it comes as part of the process? Or
I think it's part of the process, and I remember a number of lecturers talking about, the more body of knowledge you have of architectural precedents, that the more you have capacity to draw on those. We could have done the thing like look at Glenn Murcutt's work, but that wasn't the type of vernacular we were looking at. We were looking much more at the proximity of the context of those sheds. So I think we do bring those things in as part of the story. Whether or not they're a story, we always tell the client. Like we're working on one at the moment that we're drawing on aspects of Alvar Alto and the courtyard. But, if I start talking about Alvar Alto to most of our clients, they won't have a clue as to what we're talking about. Sure. But we certainly show them images of similar forms and materials, and use those images as sort of explorations and explanations as to what we're thinking, and bringing them on board with the story. I must admit, I'm probably still very old school in that I don't necessarily bring out the 3D renders of literally this is the virtual tour and this is the house that you're going to be living in. Mm-hmm. I still like the idea of the design process as something that sort of is explored over time and starts to reveal itself. But, you know, that said, we do actually have a number of buildings and designs that we have actually sort of outlined in 3D and explored in 3D, and it does help see things arise before they arise. But equally so does the model. The 3D model that we make by hand is a really interesting way of exploring form and seeing what will result. So I've sort of digressed there off that, but yeah, look, I think there's often a conceptual idea behind it, but we don't necessarily have that conversation with the client. I should say in Dean's Marsh, though, he was a graphic designer. So he has that capacity for design thinking and design discourse.
Yeah, I thought it was a lovely kind of romantic way of approaching the building, and it really did. As soon as you said that, I just brought all these images of what you definitely see in the Victorian countryside.
And particularly in that location where it's in down some of the back roads. I should say that house initially started to be, when he and I first met, we'd both been out to Tarrawarra Museum just forgot his name for a minute. And, and, you know, we were both taken with the idea of the solid round earth wall, and this idea of the solid round, you approach the solid round earth wall as this very, this sense of a very solid private wall, and then you step through and here is the view revealed. But we did the soil test, and the soil test said there is no way you are putting a massive wall with a massive strip footing all the way along that boundary, all the way along that building, because all it will do is fall down the site. So then, you know, the whole dialogue changed. And we also, it was an interesting building in that we also went, okay, this is a bit of an issue. So we engaged with the builder very early in the process as well. So we had the structural engineer and the engineer involved from day one, which we wouldn't necessarily always do, because we would normally have a reasonable understanding of what the structure is going to do and how it's going to be put together. But in this case, we were even talking about, you know, do we do it as a series of prefabricated sort of shed models that come together? And the builder drove down to the site and said no way, because the crane would roll down the site when it went to lift the pods in. So it was a particular approach to that one that was a lot of bringing all of that stuff really early into the process, so that we had the right approach and we knew from the beginning how deep our footings were going to be, and how they were going to actually hold the ground for us together.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to think about the place, like you have said throughout, just like the place being a big informant of the design and how. I was going to ask, just to touch on what you said about not being a big lover or doing the digital thing and enjoying the sketch design process. How does the practice work in terms of that? Do you guys spend a lot of time sketching and then move digitally? Do you like move back and forth and just make sure the sketching continues throughout?
I would say it's a lot of back and forth. We're certainly encouraging all of the team to. It's interesting drawing by hand when you haven't, you know, I think for Brett and I, well, certainly for me, and Brett's the same, I think. We finished university drawing by hand. I think computers were coming in at their last year for me, so that's how old I'm getting. And so it's not instinctive to me. It's not an instinctive tool, whereas for other people it is an instinctive tool. But we are trying to encourage people to, like I said, and I love that phrase, and it was a phrase I've borrowed from Troppo Architects when they gave their gold medal lecture. They talked about heart to head to hand, and I just thought that was a beautiful expression of that idea of, you know, it's coming from your heart or your head, and it's to the hand, and it's all very human connection. But look, it tends to vary, and sometimes I'll jump into the computer, even though I can't do 3D. I'll jump into the computer more to sort of rationalise things in very quickly and get all of the sort of proportioning and numbers right, etc., and fine tune it all. But then it helps very quickly to go to sketching and details to actually sort of think, I guess. And I think that's the process. And I remember seeing an exhibition of Glenn Murcutt's drawings where, and, you know, it had been such a long time since I'd done it, where he literally in his construction drawings is sitting there and he's drawing every triangle and dot and circle in the concrete hatching, or he's drawing every line to make a column look circular. And I thought, wow, that's, you know, that's really lovely time to think, whereas now you click a button and go hatch. And I think it removes that thinking time. So, yeah, so we oscillate between the two. And quite often we'll do the 3D modelling, but we'll never finish it. It'll never be a finished product. It's something we use for testing, in the same way we probably finish our handmade models more so because we end up showing them to clients. And some of our 3D renders we do show to clients as well, so they'll get more finished. But it varies project to project as to what we're exploring. No one's talking now. You're both on mute.
Okay, all right, I'll ask another one. Sorry to put you on the spot again, Kim. Okay, how, we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but how has your practice changed during the COVID pandemic? And do you anticipate any lasting impacts from it? And also, has it hindered your ability to work in your places, people and pennies way?
Can I call a friend? I've just sent that message to somebody going, can I call a friend? Look, I think everybody's finding it challenging, and let's be honest about it. I think everybody's finding it exhausting, and masks, we're all over the masks. We're done. We're sort of, you know, even in our stage 3 restrictions going up. The interesting thing is that I suppose 80% of the time we're just getting on with our individual work. Maybe that, actually, it's probably less than that. So it's working fine, and it comes down to personality. Some people are happy to be on their own and happy to crack on with their work, and our projects are generally of a scale that it's not large teams working together. So it's been okay. I think where it is challenging is in the design collaboration process, and I guess particularly in the early thinking, and that going back to that idea of hand drawing and hand sketching. So, you know, when you're sitting down with 2 people or 3 people around a table, and you could be, you know, for us, drawing by hand, I think for architects generally is part of the language. I mean, it's part of the way we talk, is to draw and circle and mark up. And so that's become more challenging. I'm not sure I'm not 100% sure it's having implications on our design outcomes. And certainly in terms of the people, place and pennies, it's certainly not stopping that conversation. So we certainly still talk about those issues. And I think pretty much most of our team understand it and get on with it. I think what it does require is for us to be more eloquent and use our words carefully at times. And I must admit, most of the team's pretty patient because I tend to lose it, but they seem to know what I mean. Yeah, so look, yeah, it has, what it will also do for, but what it has done in many respects for us, because we work in a regional sort of location and many of our clients are based in Melbourne, well, at least the holiday clients are, it's made us realise that we can communicate with them without the sort of waiting for a Saturday meeting or, you know, at a particular time that they're in town or that we're up in Melbourne, etc., that we can actually have these meetings quite readily. And we're finding we're using phone calls less. We're using Zoom more. We're using more visual, and that's been really helpful. So that's been a really big plus for us, particularly regionally. And I was aware of it before, and I'd been having teleconferences before, but never and Skype to a degree. But I think, you know, it's really changed it for us in terms of being able to work with our clients and consultants, etc. That's changed it. But within the office, I guess we also miss the sort of, I used to call it the osmosis, particularly when I was a student working in practice, that by sitting in an office or a practice, you would just hear conversations and start to learn things. And so we miss those conversations. We miss that quick sort of being able to ask somebody a quick question. It becomes a 15-minute Zoom because, of course, you feel really rude if you hang up too quickly. And you spend a lot of time on the screen. So it's a bit, I think people are a bit tired, but I think otherwise the team's been pretty resilient.
In terms of, like you were just touching on yourself as a student, and you talking earlier about how you continue to have students in your practice, is that a personal decision that kind of just plays out in your practice? Did you see examples of it, or do you think it's a really valuable thing to have in kind of like our architecture education? Do you think more practices should be moving that way?
Yeah. Yep. So I do bang on about, I'm in, as you said at the beginning, I'm in chapter council, and I do bang on about it a bit. Like I said before, it was a requirement before we went into what was fourth year, so it's sort of essentially a master's, that we had to have at least 6 months experience. That sort of stopped with both the recession, because it was hard to get work in architecture, and then international students, because there was a push that you sort of progress through. You don't sort of have this year of kind of stalling, and it obviously costs international students more money. So I was very fortunate to be employed initially for a very small sum to do a measure up with a practice, and I won't say who it was. But I remember the cheque was $8, and I thought perhaps they needed it more than I did. But they've always been advocates. So there have been practices I've worked with, Swanee Draper Architects, which is now Sally Draper, Williams Bogue, Daryl Jackson. Sorry. No, I think Daryl Jackson's always employed a student. So they were practices that always employed a student. And I know particularly with Peter Williams at Williams Bogue, it's a principle that he has, that he always employs students. And I think that it comes from both the benefit of the experience I had with that, and the legacy of these people that were so fantastic in employing me as a student and giving me those opportunities, that I think it's beholden on me to pass that baton on. But I do believe that if we don't employ students today, then that's undermining the profession of the future. So, but please, can I ask? No, we don't need any CVs.
Yes, not to.
We have a couple of students already. Thanks very much. I know that can often happen after these events.
So I just want to touch on one more thing, which is, do you have any advice for us as students, not to not as an employer, but for ourselves in terms of embodying, like taking what you've spoken about tonight, the people, place and pennies idea, and including it in our own designs and in practice in the future. Do you have anything that you'd like to leave us with, kind of on that note?
I always like to leave students with the idea of, and it's very challenging to say this, particularly to people in Melbourne at the moment, but I think some of the most wonderful experiences I've had is actually going out and exploring spaces and places, and actually observing in those places and spaces. So there's often a propensity, particularly when you're studying, to just work at the drawing board or study or what have you. But I think it's really important to go out and experience spaces and understand your physical presence in them and the impact that they have, and where does the sun come from and where is the wind coming from. They're conversations I still have with architects in Melbourne today who don't necessarily understand a northerly wind means that rain might be coming afterwards. So I think to actually to explore spaces and places and be present in them, and to really absorb that is a really important aspect of getting to know. So, you know, don't rush, and you know, it's such a catch cry of the noughties is be present. But I think it is a really important aspect, particularly about place, is just being quiet and observing and really that sense of experience. Don't fear, you know, nicking out of a lecture to actually stand in a laneway and understand the proportion of that laneway. How wide is that laneway and how high are the walls? Does it feel good? Does it feel bad? Does it feel dark? Does it feel light? Definitely go out and have those experiences as much as study hard and read.
Especially now when we
can't.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
You've got a lot of time to yourself. You can go for a stroll, have a look around. It's a good.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Use those moments of exercise to actually be in a place and think about and just be.
Okay, great. I think that's all for this week. I'd like to thank Kim again for her time and joining us here in our 4th Real Lecture of the Year. Next week, we have Mick Maloney from Maloney Architects. So make sure to set a reminder in your calendar to tune in to us next week. I know that Kim will. From all of us at the Real team, thanks to everyone who's joined us tonight and those who asked questions. It's great to see you all, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.